absolutely brilliant new book out, told largely through the stories of a small group of families. But just it's an absolutely brilliant book. It's called How the Other Half Eats, the untold story of food and inequality in America. And I'm really happy that Dr. Priya Fielding-Singh who is an assistant professor at the University of Utah in the Department of Family and Consumer Studies with Ph.D. in Sociology from Stanford, is on the line with us. She's the author of the book and is on the line with us. PriyaFS.com is her website, PRIYAFS.com, and her Twitter handle, Priya Singh, PRIYAFSINGH. Dr. Fielding-Singh, welcome to the program. Thanks so much for joining us. And as our conversations with great minds today, I found your book absolutely compelling. It's written like brilliant fiction, and yet it's entirely nonfiction. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. It's such a treat to be here.
Yeah, this is a masterpiece. You note. Well, first of all, you want to just share with people the basic conceit of the book. These I believe it was 5 families that you actually stayed with: Naya, Dana, Renata, Julie, and I'm missing somebody's name, I think.
No, that's it. You got them.
Oh, it was 4. Okay.
You got them all.
The 4 families, and how this came about. Tell us about the book.
Yeah. So my motivation for doing research for this book, for writing this book, really came from 2 places. So the first is that we know that in American society, we have these really widespread nutritional inequalities that cut across race and class, and that really privilege higher income white Americans. At the same time that we know that we have these really important nutritional inequalities that drive broader health disparities, our explanations for what is causing those inequalities have been pretty lackluster in how much leverage they've given us in understanding what the root causes are. So an explanation that we've really hung our hats on is that there are differences in geographic food access to healthy food. People will recognize this as the food desert argument. And the food desert argument is kind of the prevailing explanation that circulates in public discourse about why we have diet disparities. But that argument actually doesn't have very much explanatory power. It's estimated that just about 10% of the socioeconomic nutritional gap can be traced to differences in food access. And so my book is kind of all about that other 90%. So if it's not food access, what is going on? And the way that I chose to investigate this question was by spending time with families, by talking to families, by interviewing families, embedding myself in their lives, and trying to understand the really different contexts within which families are making dietary choices and how those contexts shape the decisions and the really difficult trade-offs that they have to make.
You note in the book, and the families that you followed, that you stayed with, ranged from people literally on food stamps to people who were in the upper end of the upper middle class. You note lower income I'm reading from page 50 of your book. Lower income families spend less on food than higher income families do. $3,776 a year compared to $12,300 a year for the wealthiest households. Poorer families also devote a greater proportion of their household income to food. 33% of their earnings go to food compared to wealthier households, 9%. And yet, does that, the sense that I got from your book was that every one of the mothers in this book was absolutely doing her best, that if anything is under assault right now in America, yes, we've got problems with our food supply, but it's motherhood. That all the judgment being laid on these women, and whether they could spend the money or not. I mean, what are we've got these real issues of things like obesity, and particularly childhood obesity, that seems to be associated with poverty or with low access to food on the one hand, and then the fact that it's very expensive if you're going to try to feed your kids just organic food, particularly in America, where we have poisons in our food that are just illegal in Europe. There's a lot of families that can't even afford that. I mean, can you speak to? I realize I just threw a lot of stuff at you, but if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, well, So when I started this project, I knew that it was a study of nutritional inequality, about food access, about food affordability, but I didn't know at the time that it was also a story about American motherhood and the incredible pressures that are put on mothers in this country to feed their children well, and the fact that children's intake, children's bodies are really feedback about how good of moms women in this country are. And the more time that I spent with families, I saw that, every mom that I spoke to cared about her kid's diet. And, I think something that might surprise people is that pretty much every mom I spoke to had a broad sense of what was healthy and unhealthy. And there was a lot of consensus across the income spectrum, from mothers who were living in their cars to mothers who were living in, multi-million-dollar mansions. Every mom understood that soda, Cheetos, Oreos were not the most nutritious foods for their kids. They understood that fruits and vegetables were the healthiest, most nutritious choices. But the dramatically different hands that these moms had been dealt really shaped whether or not they were able to act on that knowledge. And in the book, I argue that every mom is actually using food and feeding their kids in a way to prove that to themselves and to society that they're a good mom. But the really different circumstances, financial circumstances in particular, that they're trying to do that shapes exactly how they use food and what food means to them symbolically, emotionally, and that has really important implications for these diet disparities that we see across society.
Well, and you open the book with the story of giving birth yourself and the nurse in the hospital taking your child and saying, well, let's find out how good a parent you are. We're going to weigh your child, or words to that effect.
Yep.
Can you speak to that?
Yeah. So, I did the research for this book before I became a mother myself. And I think it speaks to just how clear it was to me as someone who wasn't a mother when I spoke to mothers how important feeding their kids was. Like it was so blatantly obvious that this was an issue that they struggled with. It was something that was really core to how they thought about themselves. It was something that they felt judged for and on the hook for and guilty about. And I started writing the book with that knowledge, and I knew that's what I wanted to talk about. And then in the process of writing the book, I became a mother myself. And what happened was that knowledge that I had, I actually felt it on a really visceral level when I took my daughter in to the pediatrician, and I learned that, my daughter's body was really feedback about my parenting and about how good of a mom I was. And in the book, I try to, the book is not about me, but I try to leverage the fact that I can understand what that feels like to be judged so harshly for one's child's diet and body, to infuse that kind of understanding and empathy throughout the book for the mothers that I spent time with.
One of the families that you were following, was it Naya, as I recall, Naya, who was on food stamps or SNAP benefits. And it was, you identify her as a food secure individual, and you say food insecure individuals are more likely to consume salty snacks, sugar-sweetened beverages, and red or processed meat, more energy-dense and satiating foods. I found that fascinating. It's like we've all got this evolutionary thing buried deep inside us of, oh, there's honey, or there's meat, there's a lot of nutritional concentrated value there, get that while you can. And it seems to be driving some problems here. How did the different moms that you were evaluating is probably the wrong word, but writing about, hanging out with, how did they address this issue of the impact of the basically crappy food on their kids when they occasionally let them have them?
Yeah, so you're right. So Naya was food insecure, and she was the mother who I spent time with who was really living the most hand to mouth. And just something that you point out, I just want to reiterate, for Naya and for most families that are on SNAP, about 80% of SNAP benefits run out within the first 2 weeks of the month. And so families like Naya were really left the second half of the month trying to scrape by, trying to basically maximize caloric intake for themselves and their children to make sure that their kids didn't go hungry. But something that I noticed across the income spectrum was that kids in all families were asking their parents for what we would consider junk food, like Cheetos, Doritos, Chips Ahoy, ice cream. This is the stuff that was really heavily marketed to children. It was the stuff that they enjoyed. It had been engineered to taste delicious for them. But I found that moms approached those requests from kids for junk food really differently. So for Naya and moms like Naya who were raising their kids in context of poverty, of often extreme scarcity, being able to make ends meet was really highly dependent on saying no to most of kids' requests, like kids' requests for new jeans or a family vacation or to the water park. And when I spent time with Naya, I saw her say no to her kids again and again and again. And I realized in this world of no that food was really one of the few things that Naya could say yes to on a daily basis. It was one of the few things that she could give her kids that brought a smile to their faces, that was financially feasible for her, and that made her feel like she was a good, caring mom who could provide for her children.
Am I remembering right that Naya was the one you went to the Starbucks with?
That's absolutely right. Yeah. So, one of the first days that I was hanging out with Naya, this was the day after Naya's cell phone had been shut off because she hadn't been able to pay the bill for it. And she and I had driven around trying to pawn off some jewelry for a few bucks. And we drove by a Starbucks, and Naya spent $11 on Frappuccinos for her and her kids. And this might seem like a really crazy financial choice, but in the context, Naya was raising her children, and this was actually a really rational choice to be able to give them something.
And Dr. Singh, just a moment ago, we were talking about Naya, one of the mothers that you were following for writing this book, who was on SNAP benefits, on what we used to call food stamps. And you mentioned how typically about halfway through the month they've completely exhausted their food stamp benefits. So it's a tough one, and how these low-income parents are constantly having to say no to their kids to summer vacations and trips and new blue jeans and all kinds of things like that. And so, which brings us to the story of you and Naya going to a Starbucks when I think this was early on when in your relationship with her.
That's right. Yeah. So we went to a Starbucks during a month where Naya was not sure if she was actually going to be able to make the rent on her place. And she bought her and her daughter $11 worth of Frappuccinos. And, my first reaction when I saw the bill ring up on the register was, wow, that's a lot of money for someone like Naya. But what I came to realize the more time that I spent with Naya and other moms in her situation was that spending that money in that moment to make her child happy was actually one of the most rational things that she could do. Because when you're living in that degree of financial instability, moms like Naya don't know if money today will mean money tomorrow. Like, there was always some debt collector coming by to take Naya's money. There was always a friend who needed help with bail or a utility that needed to be paid. And so what I saw was that when moms like Naya had money, they spent it on their children, because the alternative could be that they wouldn't have anything to give their kids for weeks. And that, as a mother, was completely unacceptable. And so, understanding that context helps shed light on these choices that might not seem from a nutritional standpoint to be the best. But if you think about the importance of emotionally nourishing a child, they actually make perfect sense.
Well, and in a way, it's an indictment of our society that we put low-income mothers in this horrible situation where the only way that they can, help their kids or make their, give them a positive memory of their childhood is by, giving them some junk food or something from Starbucks. It's really surprising. We have just a couple minutes left. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on policy. The book is, by the way, for me, it was surprisingly non-political. What did you learn that you would like to see put into place in the United States as changes in government policy relative to food?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think it's important to note this is a really big and complex problem that we have without easy solutions. But I often think about kind of two angles that we can work in tandem to see change on this. So the first is, as you pointed out, it is just a complete moral and political failing that we have mothers in this country who are raising their children in economic circumstances so dire that a bag of Cheetos is one of the few things that they have to offer their children. Like, we need to decide what a minimum standard of living is that every family should be entitled to, so that mothers and caregivers have more to give their children than just junk food. So I think about safety net expansions and benefits, the bolstering of social family strong policies. But I also think that a lot of that work to elevate families out of poverty needs to be paired with a reformation of the food system, and in particular, the aggressive marketing of junk foods to both parents and children, and in particular to low-income Black and Latinx kids who are really aggressively and in a predatory way targeted by the food industry to cultivate in them desires for these unhealthy foods. So we need to both be thinking about what we're going to do as far as exposure to junk food, and then also ensure that parents have the means to be able to give their kids enough so that food takes on a different meaning.
I thought it was remarkable that you kind of blew up not only the food desert myth, or maybe a smaller problem than the larger one, but also the fact that all of these mothers knew enough about nutrition to make good choices. It's just that there were other things that were important in life.
Yeah, it's really not a question of knowing. It's a question of having the means to do what one knows.
Right, and parenting children is just a tough thing in general, and in these times, we have about 20 seconds left. How has COVID made this better or worse?
Yeah, I think it's really exacerbated these really long-standing and deeply rooted inequalities in hunger and nutrition. A really simple illustration of this is that while we've seen hunger in white households go down, it's actually gone up in Black and Latinx and low-income households. So it's only getting worse. Yeah.
Dr. Priya Fielding-Singh is the author. The book is How the Other Half Eats, The Untold Story of Food and Inequality in America. Dr. Priya Fielding-Singh, thank you so much for being our great mind today. It's great talking with you.